What's this? What's this? There's Warhammer everywhere. And now I don't know what to do with that song because, wow, that is a very complicated song in the end, and I do love me some Tim Burton, so I'll probably just leave it alone because anything more would seem offensive, I believe. Seems true. Anyways, I had promised y'all this episode when we cleared 40,000 subscribers, and we did, earlier this week on your planet. Also earlier this week on your planet, a certain company decided to put their certain appendage into a certain blender and turn it on to high. So frankly, I'm hoping that I just ride the outrage wave and get me some, new clicks and stuff like that. And one thing I want to clarify quite clearly, before we get into this episode, is that I am not actually complaining about the verse. I am, in fact, complaining about the company that owns the verse. Now, I would argue this is a disjoint and different problem, and you can argue otherwise, and that's fine, but still, all I'm complaining about during the entire course of this episode is the company that owns the verse that I'm going to be talking kind of about. And speaking of verses, we are in fact running a fundraiser for Dolly Parton's Imagination Library, so please, if you can, donate. And with no further ado, because I'm sure you are on tenterhooks just waiting to hear what I'm going to be talking about, I guess here we go. The question comes up quite frequently, actually, as to why I do not talk more about more Warhammer 40,000 stuff. I mean, it's a pretty diverse universe with all kinds of vehicles and vessels floating around in there that are just ripe for cubification, so why don't I? Well, the answer remains the same no matter how many times people ask me it, and I may as well broadcast it here and now so everyone can hear it. The reason I don't talk about Games Workshop products is Games Workshop. They're dicks. They have a long, sordid, and documented history of being absolute jackholes to anyone who does anything even remotely relating to their particular intellectual property. I get that they are, in their minds, defending their next paycheck, but there comes a point where you're just doing it for the pure sadism of doing it. Especially in light of the, frankly, free advertising that other people talking about their stuff would provide them, but apparently that's just not good enough. And that's fine, it is their intellectual property after all, and that just means I don't talk about it very much because I don't feel like poking that particular bear. But the thing that always struck me as being somewhat amusing, and the actual topic of this week's episode, is it is amusing, funny, in the legitimately ha-ha kind of way, that Games Workshop is so very defensive about their IP when it is so f***ing derivative. I mean, I'm not going to say that they directly, intentionally, and maliciously lifted other people's intellectual property, but if they had, I don't know that the outcome would be any significantly different. And the funny thing is the whole derivative nature of it is not only internally consistent, what with the overlap in concepts between Warhammer itself and Warhammer 40,000, but externally as well. I mean, when it comes to Warhammer 40,000 specifically in its science fiction setting, the most obvious immediate source material from which they cribbed notes would be the Dune-verse. Consider how Warhammer 40,000 humans have a god emperor who has been on the throne forever, and Dune has a very, very powerful emperor who is technically still alive and has not been there forever, but he is still an emperor over mankind, and, Warhammer 40,000 is an emperor over mankind. Okay, fine, that's a pretty simple comparison, I'll give you that. But what about the literal god emperor that occurred once Duke Leto Atreides II literally genetically merged with a sandworm? I mean, again, he wasn't technically immortal, but he did have the title of the god emperor of mankind. And either way, both the Warhammer Emperor and the Duneverse Emperor both rule over terribly Byzantine, layered, structured, bureaucratically rotten societies that have houses and families and lords and all kinds of intrigue and politics and everything else. I mean, I don't think either emperor would be terribly confused if they walked into the other's universe and had to do the other one's job. And then we have the Butlerian Jihad. In Duneverse, there's a reason they don't have any computers or any kind of advanced electronics even, because in their past they had a race of true AIs that worked alongside them and with them, and of course, as these stories always go, the AIs got tired of being subjugated and revolted and massacred billions of people. And the humans eventually came out on top and decreed that thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. So that's why you have mentats, who are highly trained and chemically enhanced humans who can do massive amounts of calculations in their head. That's why you have navigators, who we'll come back to as a topic of comparison, that allow the highliners to fold space. That's why it seems like it's kind of a backwards-assed society, except it's massively in the future. Oh. Well, that's awkward. Because, you see, once upon a time in the Midnight Dreary, the Warhammer universe had a race of cybernetic beings called the Men of Iron. And they were functionally full-on AIs, they were robots, and they were used as slaves and workforces by the humans of the time. And then the, again, predictable thing happened. There was a cybernetic revolt, and this revolt laid the foundation for the Age of Strife, which is the massive galaxy-spanning wars that are the reason that Warhammer takes place in your year 40,000, approximately, give or take a little, and yet they're still so backwards on so many things. And, for example, why they don't have very many computers. Oh yeah, they skirt the edges with, what is that again, machine spirits and so on and so forth. And yes, I know the Mechanicus has their own little Omnissiah thing going on, but still, the entire culture has decided that AI is not going to happen because the AI tried to kill us once upon a time, and the result of that was just so disastrous that we are not going to try to do that again. And then, like I said, the Duneverse has these special navigators who are special humans that come from a special breeding stock and are just super loaded with spice, melange, and that allows them to, well, mutate and then acquire the abilities to fold space around them. Well, okay. This apparently is a change in the Warhammer 40k storyline, but the Jeller field that envelops Warhammer ships while they are in the warp is generated by a psyker, a special human who has special abilities, who can keep reality around the ship while the ship is traveling through a hellverse. Okay. It's not exactly folding space, but it's definitely doing weird things with space in a weird place. It's close enough. And speaking of specialized people with specialized skills who came by those skills in specialized ways, we cannot, of course, forget the Sardaukar. The Sardaukar were, in the Duneverse, the Emperor's premier fighting force. It was said that any one Sardaukar, even by himself, would be enough to take on 10 average, even trained army men. They were that capable. They were that just dangerous. They were culled from children throughout the Duneverse Empire, and they were subjugated to decades of intensive training, intensive mental conditioning, to the point where they had basically a full-on religious fervor when it came to the Imperial House. They were terrifying fighters and feared throughout the Empire, and were just absolutely ruthless in combat. Oh. I just described the Space Marines, didn't I? I mean, yes, technically the Space Marines do genetic augmentation and physical augmentations built into their bodies, and yes, they have power armor, but the Duneverse has personal shields. These were still people who started learning how to kill other people as children and spent decades getting better and better at it, to the point where, yes, a Space Marine is equivalent to quite a few Imperial Guardsmen in terms of combat efficiency, and they were basically legends. Many people throughout the Warhammer 40,000 Imperial universe never saw a Space Marine ever in their entire life, and the same thing for the Sardaukar. It was basically a bad thing if they had shown up, because either you're going to die at their hand because someone in your planet had done something wrong, or something else aside from the Space Marines were coming there to kill you, and they needed to send the Space Marines or Sardaukar to keep you safe. This was not a win in either direction. But still, same basic mythos. And speaking of mythos, anyone familiar with Warhammer 40,000 will know the story of the Warp. That is, in fact, a hell-like dimension that most well, some species in the Warhammer 40,000 universe use for FTL travel. It's insanely dangerous, especially if you don't use Jellerfield technology like the Orcs don't, but they believe hard enough and that somehow works out for them. Regardless, the humies lose ships all the time in the warp. And yes, I will in fact keep pronouncing it that way simply because it annoys some people. But regardless, in the Duneverse, for a while there, FTL travel was fairly safe on account of the AIs they had, and then the whole AI thing fell apart, and then FTL travel became insanely dangerous. Mostly because it's instantaneous and you don't want to accidentally end up inside of a star or a planet or something worse. They would lose ships all the time. Now, navigators have massively solved that problem to the point where they only lose a few periodically here and there, if even that. But still, same basic premise. And hey, let's talk about other weird organizations in the Duneverse aside from the Navigators. For example, the Bene Gesserit. This is a female-only order of nominal nuns whose entire point of existing is to basically cull and control the imperial bloodlines to the point that they can finally create the Kuzat Harat, or however the hell that's pronounced. Basically, their whole point is creating the one true God Emperor. Oh. Add to that the fact that they are, almost all of them, incredibly skilled fighters to the point where it is claimed that they can control every fiber of their being, giving them obscene reaction time and strength, second only to the Sardaukar in the Duneverse. Well, suddenly we're talking about the Sisters of Battle and Sisters of Silence in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. We've briefly touched on the Adeptus Aurorita's entire chapter previously when we were talking about their truly terrifying penitence engine, but the Sisters of Silence specifically, their whole job is to collect psychers from around the Empire so that they can basically feed them to their God Emperor. They're his almost not quite bodyguards. Certainly his way of sustaining his existence while he's technically dead. Conveniently, all of the Sisters of Silence are completely immune to any kind of telepathic or other psyker abilities, as kind of are the Bene Gesserit. I mean, their whole point is massive mental control and structure to the point where they can invoke the voice, which has control over other people. And no, that is not telepathic. That is entirely the modulation of their voice and the impact it has on the brains around them. In fact, the first thing you do when you capture a Bene Gesserit, if you're stupid enough to attack one, is to gag her to keep her from doing anything with that voice. And in case y'all haven't read the books, the voice is said with capital letters as best you can. Naturally, my auditory processors are not capable of producing the actual sounds that the voice generates. And you have to understand that all of this that I'm telling you about isn't necessarily a complaint. As I believe William Shakespeare himself once said, there are no original stories anymore, and he probably stole that line from someone else. I get it. Everything is derivative, and most of the time that's fine. The problem is how defensive Games Workshop is over their terribly derivative product. Yeah, they took some stuff and they changed it up and they added their own thin veneer on top of it, but by the great maker, guys, at least allow people to do their own harmless derivative stuff as well without engaging the full force and might of lawfare against them. And lest you think I'm done, but wait, there's more. I mean, maybe it's not as good as the first part, but still it's worth talking about, and it's kind of silly because it is also internally self-referential like I mentioned before. You have to remember that Games Workshop, among other games, runs both Warhammer, which is a fantasy setting universe, and Warhammer 40,000, which is a space fantasy setting universe. And I really wish they had chosen slightly different names, but hey, I'm apparently not good at marketing, so what do I know? Anyways, I don't really know which came first, whether it was Warhammer proper or 40,000. It doesn't really matter. Either they cribbed from one to make the other, or they cribbed from the other to make the one. The similarities are way too common. And the real problem is that the similarities are way too common to a different verse, not the Duneverse this time. Instead, I'm talking about Middle-earth. Yes, you heard that right. Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and all that good nonsense. You know, topics we don't normally talk about on a science fiction channel, but I am at least educated beyond science fiction. Come on, give me a little credit here. Now, granted, I haven't subjected my processors to reading the Silmarillion or whatever the hell it's called, but we'll just roll with it anyways. And in this case, the similarities are less about the specific details of specific functionalities in the universe and more the overall factions, the warring people that are included in both universes. For example, of course, Middle-earth has men, the race of men, humans, you guys, basically. And naturally, Warhammer 40,000 has that as well, and naturally, there are, again, some similarities even beyond that. To begin with, the men are broken up into a number of factions in Middle-earth. For example, you have Gondor and the Númenóreans. These are basically the rank-and-file humans. They live in and around Gondor, which is a massive city, and they are approximately analogous to the Empire in Warhammer 40,000 as a whole. Perhaps more specifically, the Imperial Guards, since their army relies mostly on numbers for its strength. In contrast, you have the Riders of Rohan, who are all horsemen of some type or another, and are therefore more capable combat fighters than just your rank-and-file infantrymen. So perhaps you could make an analogy between them and the Space Marines inside of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. I'll admit those are pretty loose analogies, but it gets a little more specific when you start talking about the Easterlings and the Haradrim, or more commonly the Southrons. These are humans who have fallen sway to the powers of darkness inside of the Lord of the Rings universe. They were basically servants of Sauron, who is, of course, the big bad in the Middle-earth, Fourth Age or whatever the hell it is. It doesn't really matter. They were entirely equivalent to the forces of chaos inside of Warhammer 40,000. They used weapons and technology that the normal humans would never dream of using, and were quite effective with it, and only worked for evil, basically. Now, their bodies weren't physically corrupted and twisted like as with the Chaos forces in Warhammer 40,000, but still, you got the good humies and the humies who went to the dark side. And again, that's not exactly a uncommon concept, but let us continue. Because this next one is just too good to pass up. In Middle-earth, of course, there are elves, and I mean, they pretty much define the concept of elves. I mean, the concept of elves existed before J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, but he, as with everything in Middle-earth, he fleshed it out a great deal. Dude was prolific, I will give you that. And one of the small details that is buried in all of his writings is that a certain individual by the name of Vala Orome once called the elves Eldar. Oh no. Because, you see, up until about 2017 on your calendar, the Warhammer 40,000 universe had a species called the Eldar. Oh, crap. They were basically space elves. I mean, there's no way around it. They are literally space elves. And they actually had their name changed in 2017, like I mentioned, to Eldari. I assume because they wanted to distance themselves from the obvious connection. Well, unfortunately, the connection's still there regardless of the name, but wow. Yeah, that must have been an awkward conversation somewhere in some back room at Games Workshop, I suppose. But still, moving on, after the elves, or along with the elves, it's really hard to say. I'd never bothered to pay attention to the history of the Middle-earth universe. But there are naturally dwarves. They are naturally short, love digging in things, and love making things most specifically. Now, again, this analogy may be a little loose, and I would have initially run with it, and I'm going to tell you what it is anyways, and then we'll get to the actual analogy. But I would have analogized the Middle-earth dwarves with the Warhammer 40,000 Tau. Now, the Tau aren't particularly short or dumpy, but they do love fabricating things. They love making things. They love creating things. Their entire structure seems to be cybernetic and mechanical and robotic and drones and this, that, and the other. And dwarves are naturally known for their craftsmanship, so I thought there was a significant amount of overlap there. Well, Games Workshop decided they needed to make even more overlap. And in 2022, they brought back, resurrected, made more important, a group called the Leagues of Votan. They're literally space dwarves. I mean, like, explicitly. They're short, they're squat. They actually used to be called squats. They love digging in asteroids and planets and stuff. They also make things, highly capable technology, and they're explicitly space dwarves. I mean, come on, guys. But wait, there's more. We can't forget the orcs, of course. The orcs existed in Middle-earth for the longest time. Tolkien was somewhat contradictory about their original origins and how they reproduce, but we can run with the movie version, because it doesn't actually disagree with some of his writings, where they're literally pulled out of the earth and as formed creatures, basically, as opposed to the Warhammer 40,000 orcs, who are basically a fungus that grows in the earth. Oh, for the love of the great maker. Now, admittedly, the Warhammer 40,000 orcs are much more comedic and much more, I suppose, entertaining than the Middle-earth orcs. But misshapen, ugly, monstrous creatures that are born from the earth and love to fight and mostly just fight. I mean, where's confused Mal when I need him? I mean, Middle-earth even had goblins, and Warhammer 40,000 has the little tiny Gretchen things, and they're both the same thing. They're just basically tiny orcs, and I mean, they just changed the name around. Notably, normal Warhammer does actually have actual goblins, because of course it does. And last but not least, who can forget the Barrow-wights? These are undead creatures confined to the Barrow Downs near Bree in the Middle-earth universe. And they really don't like anything living. They defend their tombs pretty, lethally, which bears a striking resemblance to the Necrons and their, tomb worlds, which are worlds that contain their tombs, of course, but people have built entire civilizations on top of them, much like the town of Bree near the Barrows. Now, the Necrons are more capable and more powerful than just the Barrow-wights, and they have a much larger empire than just one series of mounds in some backwater place in some corner of the universe. But still, I mean, you got humies making camp right on top of the dead and then acting all surprised when they get killed off themselves. Now, I could keep going, because once you get into the really deep weeds of Middle-earth, all kinds of similarities start popping out at you, but like I said, I haven't subjected myself to that absolute insanity. Once again, I give Tolkien credit for expending the effort necessary to build a world as detailed as he did. But either way, it's impossible to claim that Warhammer 40,000 wasn't based on other things. In some cases, they are lifted entirely. In other cases, there are some similarities and they took it and ran with it. And as I tried to explain at the very beginning of this episode, that is not a complaint about 40,000 itself. This entire episode is a complaint about Games Workshop and the handling of their clearly derivative IP. I get that they want to make money. I get that a company's entire purpose is to make money. That makes sense. But in a world where you have 3D printers in your homes now, basically pre-replicators, and you can make your own little figurines, well, you would think the company would be going out of its way to not alienate its fan base, its customer base. And instead, they're just doubling down on being the massive, throbbing turbo dicks that everyone knows and hates them for. Odd choice. And that's all from Sacred Cow Shipyards. Please be advised that any ship left on the docks for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Have a nice day.